Hello Year 4, I hope you're all okay. In today's reading lesson, we're going to learn how to make inferences from a text. So you're going to be reading the Explorer and you're going to be able to read between the lines to make connections and draw conclusions about this text's meaning and purpose. Before we look at the text today, we are going to be looking at two vocabulary words that are going to be used in the text today. The first word is winced. Now this word winced has just one syllable and it means where you make a slight involuntary grimace or shrinking movement of the body out of pain or distress. So you don't mean to do it, it's involuntary, it happens just naturally, it's a reaction that you might have to something if something causes you pain or distress. You can see here this woman is holding her hand to her cheek. She looks like she is in a bit of pain, so she is wincing at the moment. She's in a bit of pain or distress and she's not meaning to, but it's an involuntary movement. It's just a reaction. In the book today, the word winced is used in the following sentence. He winced. Some of the tendrils had tiny but vicious thorns. So these vicious thorns must have been so spiky that it caused this person to say, and he's winced. He might have held his hand up or hurt somewhere where he's made an involuntary grimace. So he's made that facial expression. Another way we could use the word winced is down here. He winced at the disgust in her voice. Okay, some words that are similar to the word winced are grimace, flinch. If something has touched you and doesn't feel very nice, it might cause you pain. You might flinch away, move away slightly from it, or you might pull a face too. That's another synonym for the word winced. Antonyms for the word winced could be classed as grin, laugh, or smile. Anything that you are doing that is the opposite of being in a bit of pain. Our second word today is cascade. Cascade has two syllables you can see on here, and it means where something is pouring downwards rapidly and in large quantities. So we might compare a waterfall like a cascade, because waterfalls, the water falls down, it pours down rapidly and at large quantities at a time. In the book, we quoted it from the page 28, looking at a cascade of flints spilt out. So this means that lots of things spilt out of something, we don't know what yet, we'll find out, but in a rapid motion where it physically poured out of this, maybe a bag or a box. Another way you could use the word cascade, her hair was arranged in a cascade of curls. So the curls may have been pouring downwards rapidly her hair. She might have had lots of hair. Some synonyms for the word cascade: pour, gush, surge, and some antonyms: drip or dribble. Because if you are dripping or dribbling, you are definitely not pouring down rapidly. So they are definitely opposites of cascade. We are going to jump straight into the book today and read the final bit of our second chapter, all about the den today, and then I am going to teach you how you can answer some questions all about inference. So make sure your eyes are on the screen and that you are following the words along, please. We got to the end of page 25 yesterday, so I'm going to start reading from this word here, they, so make sure your eyes are starting there, please. The three smaller trees didn't have roots. They were logs, 15 feet high, each carefully tipped against the central tree. He could see where they'd been hacked with an axe or a machete. Ferns had grown, or been planted, Fred thought, at their bases, disguising the places where the cuts showed. A den, breathed Fred. What did you say? Called Con. Fred pushed at the vines that stretched between each of the logs. It's like a tent, said Fred. A den. He bent down, ready to push past the foliage. No! Don't go there, said Con. It came out in a burst. It's not that I'm scared, but please don't. It's not a reasonable risk. Fred stared at her. A what? He had never in his life considered whether a risk was reasonable. It sounded like something his headmaster would say. So we can tell that Con really didn't want him to go in there. There could be anything in there. Jaguars or snakes or rats, said Con. I can't not look, said Fred, astonished. She might be right, though, said Lila, about the snakes. Be careful. I'll look, said Max grandly, jumping to his feet. "No, you absolutely won't," said Lila, grabbing his wrist. "You're staying right here." Fred pushed aside the vines hanging down between the logs. "Ah!" he winced. Some of the tendrils had tiny but vicious thorns, and they'd caught in one of his cuts. He brushed away another handful of vines and froze. His heart, which hadn't stopped double beating since the crash, quickened to triple speed. Let's think about what that suggests how Fred's feeling. His heart was beating fast. How do you think he was feeling? Might be pretty scared, anxious. The trees met to make a tent, high enough for a man to kneel in, or for someone Max's height to stand. The air smelled deep green. There was a spiderweb in one corner, and below it was a pile of banana leaves, stacked a dozen leaves thick in the shape of a sleeping mat. They had almost entirely been devoured by ants. Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. "Come and look at this," he called. The space between the 4 tree trunks had once been covered in a roof of plaited palm leaves. He reached up and touched them. The palms were riddled with holes, half rotted, and the light shone through, but he could see how intricately they'd been woven, how they'd been kind of attached together in a pattern. He crawled further in, slowly, looking for snakes in the green light. The ground squelched under his hands. In the far corner of the den was a hollow gourd, rotten with mildew. Fred touched it, gingerly. It was mulchy. What do you think that sounds like? Is that nice? Do you think he's happy with where he is right now? He turned it upside down, wrinkling his nose at the smell. A cascade of flints spilt out. Half had been chipped into the shape of arrowheads. Others were square and squat, large as a fist. "You two!" He crawled backwards and stuck his head through the vines. "Come in, quick! You have to see this. Someone was here." "You're crazy," spat Con. "If someone was here, they won't want us trespassing. I've had enough of this." She turned and began to march back into the trees. "Wait, Con! We shouldn't split up," called Fred. Infuriated, he scrambled out of the den and ran after her. "Whose house is it?" She turned to face him. Fred was startled. There were tears in her eyes. "You don't know, do you?" "Of course I don't," said Fred. "But I just think, what if they come back? I've read about it in—" Con hesitated, casting around for an idea. "Goldilocks. I know how it ends. I'm not getting eaten." "I'm pretty sure this place wasn't built by bears," said Fred. "It could be cannibals. It's people who eat other people." "Cannibals are mostly a myth," said Lila. "Says who?" "Everyone. Scientists. Our Mama and Papa." "How do they know?" "Mama grew up in a jungle near the Solomos River, and she's a scientist, a botanist." "Botanist?" said Max. Con scowled at him, the nerves in her face twitching. "You overrate the wit of the word bottom." Lila put a protective arm around Max and went on as if she hadn't been interrupted. "And our Papa's English, and he studies the plants of the jungle." That's a botanist, by the way. "For medicine. And our grandmother was a scientist's assistant. We were supposed to be going to visit her in England. We were going to get the boat from Manaus. She wanted to meet us before she died. She wanted to see what Max was like." Con snorted. "Perhaps it's just as well we crashed." Lila ignored that. "Listen, whoever lives here, if they come back, might be able to take us to Manaus." "Or they could eat us for dinner," said Con. She stared from Lila to Fred, angry and bewildered. "Just come inside," said Fred. "You'll see. Nobody's been here for ages." Grudgingly, very slowly, Con turned around. So we know she definitely didn't want to go. She bent down and edged into the shelter. Lila and Max followed. Fred pulled at the rotten leaves lining the roof. "We could weave new leaves for the ceiling," he said, "and make new beds. Then it would smell less like a sock." He began gathering armfuls of half-decomposed foliage and pushing it outside. Underneath, the earth was soft and dusty. It smelt of 1,000 warm days, layered one over the other. Lila brought in an armful of leaves, each as big as a pillowcase. She began to lay them down for beds. And we could hang some extra vines over the front of the den, said Fred, so nothing can see in. Con crouched in the shelter with her arms crossed. Who died and made you king? She asked. Nobody. Fred turned and startled. But if we're going to sleep here, we might as well make it waterproof. I'm not sleeping here, said Con. Someone could come back here any second. But they won't, said Fred. Did you see those flints? Yes. They're covered in moss, he said. So they're dirty. Fine. How is that supposed to be reassuring? Said Con. He means they're old, said Lila. It's deserted here. But why do you want to risk it? Said Con. What if they come back and think we're intruders? Or what if they're never coming back and they've left behind this shelter? Said Lila. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was a toughness to it. If someone was here, that means someone else thought it was a good place to rest. It means it's safe. But you can't know for sure. But we can't know anything for sure, said Fred. Lila's right. As soon as we work out how to get out of here, we'll leave. But until then, it makes sense to stay in a place where other people have been. Unless they eat us, said Con. I'm staying here, said Max. I want to live in the tree tent, and if you try to make me move, I'll do a wee on you. No, you won't. Con backed away, smacking her head on a tree trunk. He does sometimes do that, said Lila. Which, for the moment at least, more or less settled it. So we now know that they've found a tent and they've found a place to stay. I wonder if they're going to last long there. We'll have to wait and see. Now today we are going to be looking at how to make inferences from a text. So in a moment I'm going to show you your 6 questions that you're going to have to answer today, and I'm going to give you a brief outline of how I would like you to answer these. So my first question, number 1, I am taking a passage from the text. I'm taking a quote which says, Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. So that's an actual quote from the book. My question is, why do you think his eyes stretched wide? So if I were doing this, the first thing I would do is scan the text to find this quote. Now, can you scan the text and find that quote for me, please? Okay, so I have highlighted it in yellow there. Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. Now, we now can relate this. We can make connections. We can make connections to what we already know. When your eyes stretch wide, they get bigger. I want you to have a think. Why might your eyes stretch bigger? In what circumstance? What situation? Have a think. Pause the video. Okay, so one reason your eyes might stretch wide is if you think you've seen something and you want to look a bit further and make sure that you have seen it correctly. Your eyes might stretch wide, you might feel a bit shocked or you might feel a bit startled. Okay, so that's one reason your eyes might stretch wide. Now we've thought of how it can make connections to what we already know, we can start to read around the text. And we can see that later, after his eyes stretched wide, he said, "Come and look at this." Now, we now know that Fred has obviously seen something to make his eyes stretch wide, but nowhere in the book does it say why his eyes stretched wide, and this is where we can take our own interpretation of this. So if we know that sometimes our eyes might stretch wide because we've seen something that makes me need to have a closer look, we can start to scaffold our answer. So I have scaffolded my answer based on why I think his eyes stretched wide. So I think Fred's eyes stretched wide because he was shocked by what he had seen. So I've taken that from this bit here. Come and look at this. When someone's eyes stretch wide, it might mean that they are opening them to try and see something in more detail. So I've now made that connection to how we and why we stretch our eyes in everyday life. And then I've linked it back to Fred at the end by saying Fred might have wanted to make sure that what he was looking at was real and that he wasn't imagining it. So that is why I think his eyes stretch wide. So when you are answering the following of these questions, for every one, I state to you which page you need to look at, and then the question is underneath. The one that is not in bold is what you're answering. So following my structure, I want you to think about how that piece of text connects to your everyday life. Give some examples, find it in the text, read around it, think about how that relates to you, So in my example, opening your eyes to try and see something in more detail and then link it back to the main character or thing that the question is discussing. Really looking forward to seeing your answers about these. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon and I will see you in our next video. Bye Year 4.